Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is David Madison. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. And I'm joined today by our Director of Professional Development, Mary Catherine Duffy. Good afternoon, Mary Catherine.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. So our topic today is the rector-head partnership, shared leadership. So this is such a critically important topic. Really excited about having some conversation about this today. Before we go any further, the slides will be available in our document library. A recording of the webinar will be available in the webinar library. You can access those on the website. You'll need your login credentials. If you don't have your login credentials or need to retrieve those, just give Pat Blevins a call in our home office, or you can email her, and we'll make sure that you have access to all of those things. The way we'll communicate today is through the Q&A box. So you will see a button. If you're on a computer, it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet or a phone, sometimes it's at the top. But if you look for a button that says Q&A, that's how you can ask questions. We'll also have the chat stream going if you'd like to communicate and participate with other participants as well. Let's give the Q&A box a test drive. If you will all click on the Q&A box and let us know where you are joining us from today. Just type in your city. And we'll just make sure the Q&A box is working, and we're getting cities coming through now. So welcome everyone. Austin, Houston, Odessa, College Station, they're rolling in. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and just continue to use that Q&A box as questions pop up. We've got lots of time toward the end of our session today for Q&A, and my hope is that you'll really leave with some tangible strategies, or if you're wrestling with some specific issues, you'll leave with some ideas on how to approach those in a healthy and constructive way. So where I like to start this conversation is with a few initial observations. So these are not, gold standard observations. Just wanted to share a few things I've seen through my years of working with heads and with rectors, as well as with parishes and with schools. So a couple things. One, I really believe that the relationship between the head and the rector is a direct strategy to making sure the place is successful. I think it's just critical to the success of the school. Now, that relationship looks very different from place to place. I don't think you have to be best friends necessarily. I don't think you have to enjoy, watching football on the weekends with each other, but it does need to be a healthy relationship. And we'll talk about what I mean by healthy in a little bit. But I've yet to see a successful school where the head and rector relationship wasn't a constructive part of that. Wouldn't you agree with that, Mary Catherine? You've had that experience as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, it really sets the tone for the whole community. The community can get along great, but if the rector and the head are not in partnership or collaborating, then the community suffers for sure.
The second observation is the way that the governing body of a parish interacts with its CEO is just different from the way the governing body of a school acts with its CEO. So what I mean is vestries interact with rectors a little bit different from the way that boards interact with heads. And again, that's nothing to change or try to force the other to be more like you. But how a rector leads a vestry may or may not be the same way that a CEO or head leads a school board. It's relatively difficult to get dismissed or fired if you're a duly elected rector. It's not impossible. It certainly can happen. It's very, very different with the school board. So we have, every year we have what I would call kind of speedy terminations of heads. And so I think that sets the tone for how a board interacts with the head compared to how a vestry interacts with the rector. So just some things to take into consideration. The third observation, adding a school ministry to a parish is extremely fulfilling, but it also adds a ton of complications. And so while many dynamic parishes point to their school as their biggest outreach, that's awesome, and we love that, but recognize that outreach brings some size challenges, some complexity challenges, and some personality challenges. So we need to go into that with open eyes. This runs very differently from other types of church ministries. So if you think of other parish ministries and how they're operated, school ministry just isn't operated the same way for a variety of reasons. So you have to just be aware of that and go into that with open eyes. And then finally, I really do believe this. I'm not trying to be naive. I really do believe that everyone is doing the best they can. I speak with a lot of rectors, with a lot of heads of school, where the relationship is not great. There's lots of finger pointing sometimes, and I really do honestly believe that everyone is trying to do the best that they can. So just a few initial conversations. So we've got two leaders, two strong leaders, two passionate leaders. What can we do to help them have a great relationship and lead their communities in a healthy way? So the first thing I like to do is talk about what's similar with churches and schools and what's very, very different. And the way I frame that is churches and schools have a common mission. We're all trying to do the same thing. Schools, parish day schools grow out of the mission of the church, of growing disciples, of sending people out with the love of God to share to the world. But how they do that is just different. And so the way a school does that is a little bit different from the way a parish does that. And so my experience has told me that lots of times we try to, or we lament how the other is so different, and we try to spend all of our energy trying to force the other to be more like us. And I just don't think that's necessarily the most constructive use of your time. Rather, I think it makes sense to start from the understanding that the parish does things a certain way, the schools will do things a certain way, and how do we understand each other with an eye toward where is possible friction. So, a couple things to consider. Let's look at the parish, for example. On any given Sunday, 100% of the people in the parish are either Episcopalian or are willing to learn. They want to be Episcopalian. That's very different from the school. So, the national average is that 85% of families in our schools are non Episcopalian. They're coming to that particular school ministry probably because it's faith based and it's faith based school, but they may or may not have any interest in being part of the church community as we define it on Sunday. And that's okay. My approach to that is I would love for all of them to be in church with us on Sunday, but lots of them have church families that fuel them, that feed them, and that's okay. They're selecting us and asking us to play one role in the life of their family. Now, it's an extremely important role, which is why I love school ministry, because it has the ability to have such an impact on the family. But you may or may not see them on Sunday, and that's fine. The other element of having so many Episcopalians in one community and so many non Episcopalians in another community is that we can't really rely upon that shared Episcopal language or that shared Episcopal worldview. And there's all sorts of potential conflicts in that. That's not a problem, but it's just something to be aware of, particularly from the vestry perspective, trying to get their arms around how a board approaches things. They may approach things very, very differently from the way a vestry approaches things. The parish, everyone is there as a volunteer. Um, the school, everyone is there as a result of a contract, either an enrollment contract or an employment contract. That changes the tenor of the relationship. You can get fired from a school, you can get expelled from a school. It's really, really hard to get expelled from a parish. It's possible, you can do it, but it's very, very difficult. The school, in some ways, has a little more say in who is a member of the community. The church doesn't really have that. I mean, the church is open for everyone, and that, again, kind of affects a little bit of how the organizations are led, and it affects a little bit about how those organizations interact with their stakeholders. The parish, of course, is subject to church authority. The school is subject to church authority, but the school is also subject to a variety of secular agencies. You've got accrediting agencies. If they're accredited by us, it's a faith-based accrediting agency. But if they're accredited by a different independent school accrediting agency, it's a different worldview as well. Their expectations from the state, depending on the age student you work with. If you have students that are younger than 3, there's a licensing requirement. If you're not accredited, you've got to deal with licensing even older. But if you're an accredited school, licensing picks up below age 3. So there are all sorts of expectations about physical plan, about the arrangement of the bathrooms, about how many kids you can have in a particular classroom. There's all sorts of ways the school is being pulled in different directions that a church doesn't have to deal with. Lots of times a vestry will struggle with that and a church will struggle with that because they're like, well, why do they have to do it that way? Just put more kids in the room or
Mm-hmm.
just use those rooms. Those rooms are fine. They're great. Maybe. Depending on what the expectations of these different secular agencies are, it may be space management may be a little more complicated with the school than with the church. Churches work off pledges, which we like to think that that pledge card is a binding contract. It's really not. We hope it is, but the reality is that the income of a church sometimes is a little harder to predict than the revenue streams of a school. We like to, in a great situation, 80, 85, 90% of a school's revenue, we can pretty much guarantee will come in based on enrollment contracts. There's always 10 or 15% that's based on charitable giving, but just about everything that's coming into parishes is based on charitable giving. Along those lines, the fiscal year of both organizations is different. So my understanding is that the parish has to be on a January to December fiscal year by canon. I don't think the parish has a whole lot of say in that. Schools have a programmatic fiscal year because otherwise it's really hard for you to judge performance. So a school's fiscal year will generally be around July or August as a start and go until the end of the school year. Now, why is that an issue? Well, just think of your own personal accounting. At various times throughout the year, your cash flow situation is going to be different. Churches are flush with cash at different times of the year compared to how a school, times of the year when a school really has lots of cash on hand. That's going to affect conversations. Be very intentional about when you are having shared use agreement conversations or shared expense conversations. Just be aware that if one of the organizations is at a low point in its cash flow calendar or cash flow cycle, that's going to affect those conversations. Finally, parish has lots of volunteers. School has lots of staff. Again, that just talks about how we interact with the people that are doing the work or doing the ministry of both organizations. The employees at the school are going to be directed in one way. The volunteers at a parish are going to be directed in a very different way. One way is not necessarily better than the other. They're just the reality of how both of these organizations express their mission. Let me stop there and ask Mary Catherine if she has any comments or things she'd like to add.
No, I was just thinking about kind of when we went through when you were talking about kind of the church versus the school and how in the agencies, just this summer when we were talking about COVID and how churches were responding to COVID versus schools. One of the things that I noted that the churches' response, because their churches are not generally already set up with policies and procedures about the way people come in and do things. They had to pivot a little bit harder, I think, than schools who already have things in place, policies in place about how we come on campus and how we do the licensing stuff or how schools just are already policy oriented versus the parish that's not. And so I think there probably was and continues to be challenges between churches and schools when it comes to COVID because, churches had to start putting policies in place that they never had to do before. And
So,
schools were ahead of the game in that, I think.
so what are your thoughts on, because COVID presented a variety of friction points. What are your thoughts or suggestions on how to best navigate that? How do you best navigate a situation where where a school is having to make some changes to space that are being required by either health requirements or being
Mm-hmm.
required by other licensing agencies, where a church may really, really wrestle with that. What are some strategies or things you can suggest to the school to kind of do that in a healthy way?
Well, I think as a school, first of all, we have to recognize that, again, churches are not where we are when it comes to policies. People don't come into churches and follow rules the way people come into schools and already know that rules exist. So I think schools have to be patient with churches as they try to navigate. I'm thinking about shared space where you have a nursery and a 2-year-old room that you're both sharing. So, and the 2-year-old room is one way, and now as a school, we're having to put up maybe some plexiglass, or we're having to do some things in the room that make it safer on the weekdays. And that's a struggle for the church because it changes the space. I think we have to be patient. I think we have to ignore this. Expressions of mission is a great slide, because the priest can see, hey, we do see it differently. So I think it goes back to that relationship between the priest and the head of school. It's really important that they lead together, and that they say, that if I'm the head of school, that I say to my people, hey, we got to be patient, because the church doesn't have to do what we have to do. And that the rector probably has to say to the vestry, we're going to have to give a little, because the school is going to be required to do things that we normally wouldn't have to do. And so I think, patience is really, really important. I think that whole concept of clear as kind, having really conversations that may be difficult, but being clear, I think that's important. And I think just, geez, the whole, we're doing the best we can.
Yeah.
That's Brene Brown asked that question one time. I remember in a podcast or somewhere, where she said, what if everyone really is doing the best they can? And that really struck me,
Yeah.
because if we approach every conversation that way, especially in this really crazy year, then then we're going to have a little bit more grace for each other.
Yeah. And I'm sure from the church's perspective, sometimes, particularly with space, I'm sure it feels as if, oh my gosh, this school is just either growing or shifting and just consuming every square inch
Yeah.
of space on the campus. Did you ever run into that at St.
Yes,
Albans,
we
and kind of
did.
that feeling from the parish of, oh my gosh, what we're giving them everything. What more do they want?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a little bit of that. And I think the way you counteract that as a head of school is you continually engage the church and the parishioners in a way that is kind and patient, and with humility. I think that I would always, at parish meetings when I talked, I would always just acknowledge what a gift it was for the parish to support the school in the way that they did. And sometimes I just and just sometimes I think it's important just to acknowledge, hey, it's kind of like your college kid when you've put them through college, and it's nice to hear them say, hey, I get it, I appreciate what you've done to make this happen for me. And I think that we can do that as schools to the parish, especially for parishioners who are not super actively engaged in the school, and they don't know. All they see is that we've changed the nursery because the school needed it, or
Right.
we can't use the gym because the school needed it. If we as a school can continually be thankful, and but also engage with them about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
I may have lost. Are you? Can you? Am I
Yeah,
coming
can you
through?
hear
Okay.
me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
There we
I'm
go. There
back.
we
I'm
go.
back. Sorry.
No worries. So, one other question then. Let's look at it from the church's perspective. And when you were head of school, what did the church or the rector do that was helpful in navigating those waters? We've looked at it from the school's perspective. Now let's look at it from the church's perspective, and what can the church do to be helpful?
Well, the rector really did a good job. I think all of my rectors did a good job of making sure the vestry and the leadership of the church understood what the school was about. And so there was this, so I think that they led that conversation without me. it wasn't just me advocating for the school, it was the rector advocating on behalf of the school. And to put the school out there on a, it's kind of one of those things where we talk about when you want to have a conversation, you don't want to have the conversation at a time when it's stressful. You want to have it when everything's good. And so the rector would constantly talk about the school to the church, the good stuff about the school, what we're doing well, so that when there was something hard, it wasn't just, oh, the school did this. And so I think the rector leading in that way, and advocating in that way is really helpful. And I think the
Excellent.
church, I mean, you're going to talk about shared use agreement, I'm sure, but having a strong shared use agreement where those things are lined out and there's not, and sometimes we just, we always would say the rector, and I would say, if there's a funeral, we're going to step back.
Yeah.
And we're going to let the church lead and have the space, and we're going to go do something else. And so having that shared use space agreement really helps.
Thanks for that. And so we're going to move on. But before we do, I just want to remind our participants, if there's specific questions that you're wrestling with that you'd like to get a little bit of feedback from, not just from Mary Catherine and from me, but from other participants, make sure to use that Q&A box, because we'll spend some time today really trying to give some concrete guidance and some concrete counsel to any issues that you're wrestling with on this topic. So, okay, let's keep moving forward and now look at the different gears. So parish day governance, I think a gift that you can really give to both the board and the vestry is a full understanding of this chart and what we mean by parish day school governance. So this just looks at the different players. We've got the diocese at the top. The diocese then, of course, has parishes. The vestry calls the rector. The parish then delegates its authority and empowers the school board to be the governing body of the school. The board then hires the head of school, and then the head of school hires all the employees. So I think first and foremost, everyone needs to understand this parish day school governance perspective, because it's a little bit different. So there are no lines, for example, between all employees of the school and the school board, because the employees don't work for the school board. There's also no direct line between the parish and the head of school, because the head of school doesn't really work for the parish. Now, this is different. In a parish environment, just about everyone works for the rector. And that's the way that the canons establish things. It's a little bit different when that vestry creates a board, a school board, and delegates its authority to that school board. Now, that delegation of functional independence is not, here are the keys, you can do whatever you want,
Right.
Sell the property, buy the property, take a bunch of debt, have fun. It's not that. But it's functionally independent. What I mean by that is the board has delegated, or the vestry has delegated authority to the board to be the governing body. How that relationship maintains and how that relationship is managed is critically important. Sometimes you can do that with vestry representation on the board. Sometimes you can do that with, in the Diocese of Texas, the rector is by canon the chair of the board, unless that authority is delegated. There's a variety of ways to maintain that relationship, but there's functional independence between the board and the vestry. And that's a challenge. Mary Catherine, any thoughts on that? It's just a challenging relationship to maintain.
Yeah, I think again, the key to this is the rector, in my opinion, because the rector needs to make sure that the vestry is clear on how that works. And sometimes I think that's where you run into challenges, when the vestry doesn't understand that they're not connected necessarily between with the head of school. For me, in my experience, it was always the rector always made clear to the vestry what they could talk about and what they couldn't. So,
Yeah.
for example, a practical example is when I would go and talk to the vestry about, and I would maybe, I would always give them financials of the school every month. They just had a copy of the financials, and that's how we did it. But they weren't really allowed to, the rector didn't really allow them to comment because that wasn't really their lane to look at. It would have been their lane if we had a real big issue, but why I'm spending this on curriculum, or why are you doing, how much, why are you paying your teachers this or that? That wasn't a conversation the rector would allow at a vestry meeting. So that's a practical example of how a rector can make or break, I think, that what the vestry is able to do, and if they can overstep. And so that was always super helpful to me because, occasionally I would have a vestryman who wanted to, kind of get in my business
Yeah.
about things. And the rector, it was difficult for me to go, hey, that's not appropriate. So it's kind of like what we talk about with the school board. The rectors was able to go, whoa, no, that's not our lane.
And it's again, this is also so complicated because experienced vestry people, particularly if there's a track record of maybe there have been some financial challenges with the school,
Mm-hmm.
then the vestry does need to ask some
Yeah,
appropriate
for sure.
questions and get involved. However, the vestry is not the finance committee of the school board.
Right. And it is gray a little bit in that particular topic. It's gray. Um, an easier topic would be, hey, we're having our Halloween party this month, and why are you doing that? Because it's Halloween. Why are you doing Halloween? That's a better example probably of when the vestry might be overstepping.
Yeah. So again, I think it's just important to understand the two big things, the two big takeaways. I think for parishes and for vestries, I think the biggest takeaway is you've empowered a school board to be the governing body. Allow the school board to be the governing body.
Right.
I think the takeaway for the school is you have a school board, but there is a clear relationship between this school board and the vestry. So you cannot be an island unto yourself. Um, I think that's the takeaway
Yeah.
from the school side.
Yeah, that's great. And I really do think, especially, there's a little bit of onus on the school to remember that, because sometimes we get, as a school, especially if you maybe don't have a head of school that's an active member of the parish like I was, you just kind of forget. And it's,
Yeah, you do, and also you have to look at your peers. I mean, heads of school hang out with other heads of school,
yeah,
and so heads of school maybe hanging out with other heads of school from different types of school that don't have this particular
right,
governance model.
right,
And so I think it's important to recognize that, and we may your peers may be heads of school at independent schools that don't have to deal with any of this.
right,
Well, you do. If you're head of a school of a parish Episcopal day school, then there's no way to avoid this, and don't there's no way to don't resent this either. I mean,
right,
this is a parish day school, so this is the way things work. Focus your energy on how do we make it as healthy as possible.
correct.
So, a couple things I want to add, just that are COVID specific in this relationship. And specifically, I want to go to that second one. Obviously, the first one about the ever shifting landscape of COVID. Oh my gosh, it's continuing. And friends, I'm sorry to report this, but I'm afraid we're probably going into a period where things are going to get a little bit worse before they get better. I hope I'm wrong, but just speaking in my area, our cases are up, our hospitalizations are up. I have a hard time thinking that's not going to have an effect eventually on how we do school in the coming months. But
Right.
the takeaway is just these things are shifting nonstop. So make sure that there's more than just the head of school who is tasked with being on top of all that. The second one really is, how does the board react to unhappy stakeholders? What I mean by that is we're going to have a whole lot of unhappy people. Just think of masks. Masks were an example when schools were trying to figure out, should we wear masks? Should we not wear masks? That became a really challenging question because no matter what the head of school said, a pretty large chunk of the constituency was unhappy. And so boards need to really have a philosophy on how are we reacting when we have unhappy stakeholders. What you don't want to become is the court of last review of every administrative decision the head of school has to make. Now, why am I highlighting this in a conversation about rectors and heads. Well, rectors will get triangulated like nobody's business.
Mm-hmm.
And so rectors need to be prepared for that and have a really good strategy on how do I respond when I have a very unhappy stakeholder, potentially an unhappy, important parish stakeholder who has a problem or a complaint about what's going on at the school. We really need to start working through what's our philosophy on that and what are we doing to make sure we don't get triangulated into that.
Yeah, and David, one thing I would add to that is for rectors is this. Um, I mean, obviously, it's not just parishioners that would go to a rector, but I mean, when in my situation, it was parents would go, and when they
Sure.
didn't like what I had done, they would go to the rector because we always had really engaged rectors. And I think it's appropriate for a rector obviously needs to listen to the complaint to some extent
Sure.
to determine what do we have going on here. But I think the rector also has to be super careful not to unintentionally listen so much that they because you know how people are, they listen to me and we're listening and we're nodding and we may not agree, but it appears that we do. And so as a rector you have to be really careful where to draw the line on I'm going to listen and where I'm going to just put a stop to it and go, you need to go talk to the head of school. Now, having said that, some of the best things that ever happened to me were when my rector would listen and go, well, thank you for your input, but you need to talk to Mary Catherine about that. But then they would make a beeline to my office and say, this complaint came and I think it's legit, or, hey, be prepared, it's coming, or whatever. But I liked it. I appreciate, but they didn't triangulate me. They didn't say, oh
Or
yeah,
and they
I
didn't
agree.
direct you. They didn't tell
Yeah.
you how they want it. Yeah, there's one thing to say, hey, this is coming, or hey, just want to share this information.
Mm-hmm.
There's another thing to say, hey, this thing's coming and here's what you need to do about it.
Yes, that's right.
That feels different.
Right. And what felt good to me was this is coming and it could be legit. I think you should consider it, because that felt like it was my partner telling me, hey, you may have unintentionally created an issue, and then I could fix it. But to not tell me, or to unintentionally agree with complainers that just want to complain, and now you're invested and you're kind of triangulating. It's hard, it's tricky. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's really important that the rector know what they're doing if they're unintentionally triangulating without even realizing it.
Well, it's especially challenging, I think, for rectors because if let's say it's a parishioner who's coming
Mm-hmm.
and complaining about A, B, or C, and then the rector tries to direct the person to the head of school, sometimes then the rector's accused of passing the buck.
Correct.
Or the rector's accused of not caring.
Yep.
Or the rector's accused of just why won't he or she get in there and quote fix unquote that.
Yeah.
And that's a hard, that I sometimes think on the school side, I don't know if the schools really recognize what a burden that takes as well, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. And I do think it is a burden. And that's where that goes back to the rector head relationship being secure, because sometimes, I mean, there were times where I had to, I chose to take a hit to protect the rector a little bit. I chose to make some concessions simply because I knew that there was not a clear answer.
Right.
And so I think sometimes you do that. And then sometimes the rector chooses to be the, to take the hit and say, no, this is how we're going to do this at the school, even if they don't, if the parishioner doesn't like it. So I think that's where that relationship is really the relationship of trust and consideration and thoughtfulness between the two people really matters.
Yeah, I think so. So let's look at a couple. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. You'll have the slides, but I'm going to go through these relatively quickly just to kind of talk a little bit about what's the rector's role in the school, what's the head's role in the parish. So the rector really should consider, what's an appropriate level of engagement in the life of the school. That can take all sorts of different appearances based on physical plant, based on the size, based on the local practice, all those things. But not it's not unusual for the rector to have regular visits in classroom and on campus. Don't want the rector popping in every single day because that can be disruptive to the program. But coordinated visits to the classroom and certainly the ministry of visibility, the ministry of presence, I think, is critically important in the hallways, even at drop off pickup time, whatever that looks like in the community. Cultivating relationship with the faculty and the staff, cultivating relationship with the parents, and then obviously engaging members of the board and appropriate committees. In summary, you really represent the school to the larger community as the rector, and you serve as the spiritual leader of the community. Now, what I don't put there is the only spiritual leader of the community. I think the head is also a spiritual leader of the community, but depending on the size and local practice, sometimes the rector will have a role in chapel, sometimes the rector will have a role in the religious instruction. I was at a parish day school where that was kind of shifting. The school was growing from a point where all of the clergy at the parish taught, and then through just the growth of the school and some things they wanted to do with their curriculum and some things they wanted to increase, they moved away from that and moved into more of a religious instruction being handled by faculty members and chaplains on campus. But in your community, Mary Catherine, what did that look like with regard to the rector interacting with the school?
Yeah, I mean, in our community, the rector is very visible, very much an active part of the school in every way. And the rector is also in our parish day school was also the decider of how the chapel program went, and was really oftentimes the leader of chapel at least a couple of times a week. I did a lot of chapel myself, but that was, we worked together, but I didn't create what the chapel themes are going to be or what scripture. That all came from the rector. So that's very common in these smaller parish day schools where you've got a rector and an assistant rector, but you don't have a chaplain. And they serve as the chaplain as well, and they oversee. We had a religion teacher so that the rector would kind of oversee and help that religion teacher decide what we're going to, what are we going to cover this year? What is the curriculum we're going to use? So in some schools, it is definitely a little bit more hands-on than others, but that's how we did it.
And I think a lot of that depends on the physical arrangement and the size of the program.
For sure.
So in the school that I served, it was very, very different. The rector, we had a chaplain. So the rector was not there regularly for chapel services, except maybe a couple of times a year. The rector was not physically present, but that was because the church and the school were about 12 miles apart.
Yeah.
So, back in the 60s, and when the school and the church were on the same campus, the rector was, I'm sure, way more visible. So I don't know if there's a right or a wrong way to do it per se, but it depends on a handful of different things. But there does need to be discussion around what is the rector's engagement in the life of the school. So we sometimes talk about best practices and worst practices. Worst practices would be the rector's never there, or rector's there 24/7,
right,
doing everything. Those would be, I think, worst practices, with best practice trying to figure out what's the, for lack of a better way to describe it, what's the Goldilocks approach. And if there's a chaplain, obviously the chaplain needs to be physically visible as well. That doesn't necessarily mean to the total exclusion of the rector, but that needs to all be navigated as well, I think. So in your environment, there wasn't a chaplain, correct?
No. And really in the Diocese of West Texas, other than TMI, most people in our diocese we don't have chaplains.
Gotcha. So again, it just depends, but the point's the same. There needs to be an appropriate discussion on the rector's engagement in the life of the school. Now go ahead, Mary Catherine.
Well, I was going to tell you, we have a question. You may want to do this later, but in the case of upset significant stakeholders, would it be fair to say that the school, as an extension of the church's ministry, falls de facto into the larger consideration of the viability and longevity of the life of the parish?
So I'm not exactly clear on, I see who's asked that. The person who's asked that, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to turn your mic on and let you ask that question. So type a Q&A in. I don't want to type a Q&A and let me know. I'd love to turn your mic on. And actually, I'm going to turn to, I thought I saw a raised hand. I thought I saw a raised hand, but maybe I didn't. If someone raised their hand, raise it again.
I
I
don't see
think,
one.
okay, I must have, okay, sorry. Colin said he accidentally raised it. Yeah, but the person who asked the question about the significant stakeholder, I'm not, Mary Catherine, I'm not clear on what exactly he's
I
asking.
think the
Can you
question
tell?
is that the school, when it comes to the life of the parish, when significant stakeholders are upset, and the school is an extension of the church ministry. And so I think what he's asking is, does the larger viability and longevity of the parish, does the parish end up making decisions about the school because the school is a ministry? That's how I'm reading that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what he's really kind of talking about is when you're a rector and you are having to kind of solve all the hold everybody, all the stakeholders in together. The school is a ministry, and does it not have to defer sometimes, I think, to the church? I mean, that's kind of when sometimes it does, and
Yeah, it's a
sometimes
good
it doesn't.
question. Yeah, it's a good question that really, I don't know if there's a black and white answer to that. I don't think I can say absolutely yes, absolutely no.
Right.
All I can tell you there is that, look, the viability of, it's in the best interest of both organizations that they remain healthy.
Yeah.
So you don't want to, you have to have conversations. And that happens a lot. Sometimes a parish will be either more conservative or more liberal than a school. And
Yeah.
so there'll be a little bit of friction. We've run into this before with other schools. There'll be a little bit of a friction because one organization is wanting to do or say something in connection with Episcopal identity that the other organization is uncomfortable with.
Right.
It always turns into, this has the potential of really upsetting donors on one side or
One
the
end of
other.
it. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to say that. I don't know if I can say that one always has to yield to the other or not. I think that that's a relationship management challenge that the school and the parish have to kind of navigate together and
Yeah.
have to do the best they can to both be true to what they're being called to do while still articulating that as clearly as possible to the upset stakeholder.
Yeah. I
I don't know
think.
if that makes sense or not, but
Yeah.
that's the only way I know how to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that, and he's saying that, but we are answering his question. So I do think that at the end of the day, it's like a marriage.
Yeah,
Sometimes one person defers to the other, and sometimes the other one defers.
yeah.
There's no black and white answer. I think about when and how that happens.
It's a great question though, and it's a great expression of the reality of this whole parish day piece.
Yeah,
You know,
no, and
you've
it's
got,
definitely, it's a great question because we're all,
yeah,
every parish day school is going to run into that at some point.
and yeah, you're going to have donors on either side as well
Hmm.
that'll potentially be upset. So let's move forward and talk about now the head's role in the life of the church. Same basic question. In some of our churches, some of our schools, the head of school is an Episcopalian. In some of our churches, the head of school is a parishioner. That was your experience at St. Albans. You're
Right.
an Episcopalian and also a member of the parish. That's not. I think in some ways it's easier to maintain that engagement in that situation.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it's easier.
A lot of our schools don't have that. A lot of our schools have non-Episcopalian heads that are going somewhere else on Sunday. A lot of our schools have Episcopalian heads that go to a different church for a variety of reasons, maybe by choice. They may want to have a little bit of distance on Sunday. So regardless, there needs to be attendance at what I would call the significant event. So the annual parish meeting, if there's a patronal feast, Episcopal School Sunday,
Mhm.
there's a handful of just important church school days where the head needs to be in church, and that should be discussed ahead of time. The head needs to represent the church to the school community and be that constant reminder that, you know what, we are a parish day school and we are an extension of the parish's ministry, and everyone who is on board has signed up for that. And so
Mhm.
we have to kind of, gently remind people of that. There's that partnership with the rector to ensure that spiritual objectives are made and then are achieved, and then also regular communication with the parish about what's going on with the health of the relationship. There needs to be regular communication about the plans of the school, the needs of the school, so that when we get into those shared use conversations, we've got a platform to work off of. So, if there are four pieces of advice I would give for cultivating the relationship between the head and the rector, I would say these are really important. Regular meetings. So, Mary Catherine, when you were at St. Albans, there's two different ways to do this. One way is to have a regular scheduled meeting every week, and the other way is just catch as catch can. What was kind of your approach on having regular meetings with your rector?
Well, I think it depended on, typically it depended on the rector, if I had a rector, my first rector was pretty um, unscheduled as a general rule, and didn't kind of really follow a calendar other than kind of, he did, but if I needed to, if I jumped in his office, it was cool. If he jumped in my office, it was cool. My next rector wanted a schedule, and so we set one every single week. We had a set meeting that we had, and so I think it kind of depends on that, how you are and how they are. And again, I think it goes back to, if you're both the same, that's easy.
Yeah.
If one of you is super scheduled and one of you is not, then you're going to have to kind of come to agreement about how that works. And it has to be, we're going to have to give a little bit. So, but the regular meetings do matter.
Yeah.
And they matter because you're building relationship, and you cannot do that without a regular meeting.
So worst practice in that area would be the only time we talk is when there's a problem
Yes, for
or when
sure.
there's a crisis. That's the worst practice. So with regard to support, just what are we doing to intentionally support each other? I mean, what is the head doing to intentionally support and build up the rector? What is the rector doing to intentionally support and build up the head? Worst practice there, I think, is backbiting
Yeah.
and talking poorly about the other, either individually or organizationally. I think that's the worst practice there. And probably the best way to make sure there's very little to no support that will ever occur, because that will erode trust.
One thing I would say about this too is that I want to reiterate that we're not talking just about how can the rector support the head, because the truth is that until I worked in a school and a church environment, I really had no idea how hard it was to be a priest.
Yeah.
And the depth of doing life with a group of people like priests do. They have funerals, they have to deal with, they work with people who are struggling with their kids. There's a lot of burden that a priest carries. And so I would just reiterate that it's not just about the support isn't just about, oh, the priest should support the head of school, which I do think they should.
Sure.
It's a hard job. Being a head of school is really hard, but make no mistake that being a priest is really hard too. And I found that the best thing I could do is, because I had regular meetings with the priest, I would always say, tell me what's going on with you.
Yeah.
Tell me how you are. What can I do to support you? Because there were times that the priest had to make a hard decision, and I can assure you, I would hear from parishioners. Being a parishioner myself, I would get phone calls from a parishioner about, why is he doing this or why is he doing that? And guess what? Every time it's, you know what? This isn't a conversation I'm going to have with you. So what I would want from the rector is the same thing that I would give to the rector, and that
And
support is critical.
That is a really good point because that triangulation works the other direction, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
If
Especially if you're a
there's
parishioner.
Yeah, if you're a parishioner or a head of school,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something going on at the parish that has upset folks, yeah, that
Yes.
triangulation piece. So heads, practice what you would want
Yes.
if it was going the other direction.
Yeah.
The covenant of no surprises, we talk about that a lot. Clear as kind, if you like Brene Brown language, however you want to describe it. No surprises. Even on your birthday, people don't like
Right.
surprises. So,
Right.
so just be intentional about that. This a lot of schools really struggled with this during COVID because things were going so quickly
Right.
and decisions were having to be made quickly. But really, really do what you can to make sure that there's no surprises. Just that ends poorly. And then finally, engagement. You got to lean in, and this is tough because lots of times this relationship will be strained. Worst practice there is just to disengage.
Right.
You have to engage in this relationship. There's just no other way. Other suggestions that I would throw out, and I share these with heads and with rectors. Know the canons of your diocese. So if you're a head, for example, in your diocese, there very well may or may not be a canon that specifically talks about schools. If you're in the Diocese of Texas, it's very extensive. If you're in the Diocese of Dallas or West Texas, it's there. It doesn't say as much. Some dioceses don't have a specific canon that talks about
Mm-hmm.
schools. Know the canon. Why? Because the rector has to follow that canon. Okay, the canons are non-negotiable, and the rector is expected to follow the canons. So know what those canons are. Read, mark, inwardly digest, whatever, and also be aware of changes. Canons change, so be aware of when canons change. Is there a Dawson Schools Commission? There may or may not be in your diocese. Diocese of Texas has one. Diocese of West Texas has one. Believe the Diocese of Western Louisiana has one as well. If there is a Dawson School Commission, consider serving on that if you're a rector. That's a great way to learn about school operations, to learn about how the diocese interact with its schools. Also, if there's a chair of that committee or a staff member attached to that committee, utilize them as a resource. They're a great resource for you. And then finally, know what you can control and what you can't control. Sometimes the canon really talks about things that the boards can or can't do. Sometimes they talk about board composition. Just be aware of those. We're not going to go through all the canons, but I advise all the rectors and all the heads as well. Just be aware of that. Okay, we're going to stop and see if there's any questions for discussion. So MK, do we have any Q&A? We've got about 5 minutes left. Any Q&A? I've got some preloaded questions if we don't have any, and I'll follow your lead.
Yeah. No Q&A at this point. So jump on the preloaded.
So some of the ones that we received, here's one. Who should propose changes to the bylaws of the school? So great question. I think it probably depends on what type of change it is. So when I think about bylaws, generally I like to have boards review their bylaws regularly and suggest updating or changes that need to occur. However, if there's a canon change or some expectation at the diocesan level, it's quite possible that a canon proposal may originate from the vestry. Did you have any experience with changing bylaws when you were the head of school, Mary Catherine?
Well, we never had any bylaws proposal changes in from the vestry. When we worked on our bylaws, we always got them approved by the vestry, but the changes usually came from the school side. So, I mean, I'm sure if there was something, like you said, canonically that needed to change, or there was something maybe that a parishioner or a vestry member saw that needed to be changed, I'm sure that they could propose it. But I believe it's up to it's up to the board to make those changes, but then at least in our diocese, and I'm pretty sure in the Diocese of Texas, it has to be approved by the vestry And in the
Yeah.
Diocese of Texas, I believe it has to be approved by the diocese.
So, wherever the change originates, then yeah, you've got to kind of figure out what are the next levels up the chain
Yeah.
back to our diocesan governance or our parish day school governance. But yeah, I think worst practice here would be if the vestry proposed an entire new bylaw set and handed that to the board. I
Right.
think
Right.
that would be worst practice and would question whether or not that board's got the functional independence it needs to govern its affairs.
Yeah. We do have a question that popped up. Let me read it to you.
You bet.
Our school is blessed to have an assistant head of school. What should their involvement be with the rector? For example, all three meet regularly at the same time, different times. What do you suggest?
So I would think whatever serves the head of school in that role. So you took the question, was it an assistant head of school or assistant
Yes, it
rector?
was
I'm
an
sorry.
assistant head of school.
Yeah, so assistant head of school. So if you're an assistant head of school that is interested in getting involved in that, you would approach the head of school and kind of express that interest and see if that would help that relationship.
Yeah. Okay.
Here's another one. What if there's a disagreement about how to plan chapel? Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So again, it kind of depends a little bit on the structure of the organization. Is it a shared campus? Are they apart? What's that look like? So this is a hard one because it's very, very difficult as a parish day school to, if the rector wants to have a say in how the chapel should look. I don't think that's inappropriate. I
Right.
think it's potentially inappropriate for a rector to dictate that school worship should look exactly like church worship because the ages are so different. But I don't know if I have a really quick answer for this, but I think it needs to be hashed out. I think you need to look at the canons to ascertain whether or not the local Dawson canons have a opinion on this with regard to the worship and the authority of who gets to say, what worship looks like. That tends to be the rector's call. What are your thoughts, Mary Catherine, on
Yeah,
that?
I'm just thinking
That's a
about
hard
like
one.
what pops up is where you would have a disagreement, where you might have a rector who is planning chapel, like you said, that's not really child appropriate. I have run into situations, not in my own school, but where I've seen where the rector didn't have a real good grasp of the fact that it was a preschool, for example,
Yeah.
and we're doing one liturgy in a preschool environment, and so that can be a challenge. I think that goes back again to having conversations that are clear and honest. I think that's what it comes down to when you're having a relationship with. Now, the other side of the coin is, and my first reaction was, because I came from a parish day environment, the rector is the decision maker in this.
Yeah.
So I think, but I do know that is where it can be difficult for a head of school if you've got a rector who's not real clear or really understanding that what they're doing as the chapel program is not translating to the age of children that you have.
Yeah, I think worst practices from the head of school's perspective, I think worst practice would be trying to shut the rector out of these
Right.
conversations.
Right.
I think from the rector's perspective, the worst practice would be handing down a Sunday worship format and expecting that to happen in the parish day school. Those would be, I think, the two worst practices. I think best practice for when there's a disagreement is really trying to find some common ground and trying to find some kind of approach that satisfies both.
Right. I agree.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. So thanks, everybody. And just in closing, I would say we know how difficult this can be. And the hope would be if you lean in, if you engage, that you'll be able to navigate some of the challenging waters that are parish day school governance. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to stop the recording. We're not going to run away. We'll hang around for a little bit if there's more questions, but I do want to honor everyone's time. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.